The year is 2007, and a woman named Holly is getting herself ready to meet someone. She is sitting in her living room when there is a knock at the door. Holly is happy to see a man named Eric Messer, who asks if he's late. It seems that this is the first time the two of them have met each other, which is the case as the two of them reveal that they have been set up on a blind date by their mutual friends. The two of them head out, and we find out that Eric has just moved to Atlanta and has known their mutual friend, Pete, since high school. Holly asks Eric where he's parked his car but is surprised to realize that Eric hasn't come in a car at all but on a motorcycle. Eric happily hands her a helmet and asks her to jump on, though Holly is reluctant to do so as she is wearing a dress and heels. She suggests the two of them go to dinner in her car, which Eric is disappointed by. Once in the car, Holly asks Eric where he's made reservations. Eric doesn't say anything, but Holly immediately realizes that he forgot to make reservations from the sound he makes in response. Just then, Eric gets a phone call and Holly informs him that he should answer it. Though to her shock, Eric is speaking to another woman and is arranging to meet up with her after his date with Holly is over. This infuriates Holly, who storms off before telling Eric to get out of her car. She immediately calls her friend who set up this blind date, Allison, informing her that the only way she could make it up to her is if she never sees Eric again. While Eric drives off on his motorcycle, we see that even though Eric and Holly never wanted to see each other again, they attended the same events as one another due to their friends, Allison and Peter, being married. However, their dislike for one another remained, as Eric often flirted with other women in front of her and purposely made her uncomfortable for his amusement. Eventually, Allison and Peter have a child together, a daughter named Sophie. Both Holly and Eric are very fond of Sophie, often taking care of her when Allison and Peter are busy. One day while Eric is playing with Sophie, Peter asks him how his relationship is going with the girl he recently met, to which Eric informs his friend that he has split from her. At the same time, Allison is in the kitchen speaking with Holly, asking her if she would be interested in her doctor who happens to be single. Holly immediately refuses, as she believes that Allison has the worst track record when trying to set her up with someone. In the yard, Peter and Eric are speaking to workers who have set up the bouncy castle for Sophie's birthday. Peter is furious when he realizes that the two workers have been using marijuana and confiscates it from them. The workers flee when Peter threatens to call the police, but he is secretly pleased that he was able to get some marijuana for himself, stating to Eric that Allison and he like to relive their youth once in a while. Eric doesn't think much of it and starts jumping with Sophie in the bouncy castle while throwing her in the air. Peter tries to warn his friend, though Eric ignores him, and to his surprise, Sophie vomits on his face. Later, Eric is in the kitchen washing the vomit from his face, while Holly is sitting at the table holding Sophie. Holly taunts Eric, amused by Sophie vomiting on him. Just then somebody rings the doorbell, and Allison is excited that their babysitter, who she calls the baby whisperer, has arrived. Eric is excited to see if the babysitter is his type, though is disappointed when she walks in and realizes that she is a child. During the party, Eric and Holly are separately conversing with guests, though they quickly get bored and uninterested. The two of them are glad when it's time for Sophie to blow out her candles, which Allison handles as Sophie is too young to do it herself. A few months later, Eric arrives back at his apartment after a run, and is greeted by a woman who is dating. Meanwhile, Holly is back at work at her bakery. She quickly takes over at the cash register as a regular customer she has gotten to know recently named Sam has arrived, and Holly is keen to speak to him whenever he comes in. Sam asks for his usual order, though Holly asks if he would like an alternative today, which he accepts. He then asks her for her name, and she introduces herself, which pleases Sam as it's obvious the two have a mutual interest in one another. As Sam is about to leave, Holly asks him if he wants to leave his contact card in a bowl of others, and that the winner who will be picked at random will get a free lunch. Sam instead leaves Holly his card and asks if she would like a free dinner with him, and then takes his leave. Eric is busy at work, where he works in the NBA broadcasting room. A friend of his named Simon is speaking to him about how much he hates his boss as he's always picking on him, which amuses Eric as by contrast their boss is very fond of him. Meanwhile, Holly is taking a bath while using her phone, trying to get in touch with Sam. Earlier in the day, when Sam put his contact card in a bowl, it got mixed with other contact cards, and because Holly does not know his surname, she doesn't know which Sam is the right one. Holly resorts to calling the numbers on all cards of everyone named Sam, which she ends up getting in trouble for as she calls a married man whose phone was answered by his wife. Holly keeps trying to find Sam by going through the rest of the contact cards. However, she is surprised to suddenly receive a phone call asking for her. Holly rushes to the hospital, where a police officer asks her if Peter has any relatives they can get in touch with. The officer states that he needs to contact Peter's next of kin as he and Allison were in a car accident, and neither of them survived the accident. Holly is devastated and in tears, immediately asking the officer if Sophie is safe, and is informed that Sophie wasn't even in the car but at home with a babysitter. Later that night, Eric arrives at the hospital and he and Holly stare at each other as she succumbs to tears and embraces him. The two of them go to Peter and Allison's home and call the Child Protection Services to find out how Sophie is. Holly is frustrated when the operator informs her that they won't decide on Sophie until tomorrow. She angrily hangs up, and Eric asks her to stay over the night so they can answer the phone if the Child Protection Services call early tomorrow. Holly agrees and Eric lets her have the guest bedroom, while he sleeps on the couch inside a room on the ground floor. As he enters the room, Eric sees one of Sophie's toys. He holds it, looking at it for a while before he starts crying himself. The next morning, Eric walks into the kitchen and is informed by Holly that Peter's lawyer is coming over to speak to them about something important. When the lawyer arrives, he apologizes to the paid for arranging a meeting while the loss of the friends is so fresh for the two of them. He goes on to state that Peter and Allison had arranged for guardianship in the unlikely event they both passed at the same time. Holly and Eric are in shock when they're informed that their deceased friends arranged for them both to look after Sophie, asking if there's been some sort of mistake. However, the lawyer explains to both of them that they can say no, as taking care of a child is a big commitment. The two of them take a break, and each of them steps outside to take a deep breath. Once back, Eric asks the lawyer if there are any relatives who can take care of Sophie, to which they are both informed that Peter's father is a possible candidate as well as some cousins. Both Eric and Holly are pleased to hear that, and Eric even states that he believes his friend's father is perfect to take Sophie. However, Holly asks if it's possible that only one of them can take care of Sophie. The lawyer doesn't answer whether or not that's possible, just that the two of them were named possible guardians. He then suggests that if the two do decide to raise Sophie together, they should move into Peter and Allison's home together, much to the pair's shock. The next day, the two of them sign some forms at the Child Protection Services office, and are finally given custody of Sophie, who they take back home with them. Holly is sitting in the living room when Eric walks in holding a beer, frustrated that his friends chose to make him the legal guardian of their child without him knowing. Sophie is sleeping in her crib, and Eric voices his frustrations at Holly, who is trying to write up a sleep schedule for Sophie. Eric asks if they're now supposed to live in their late friends' homes together. Holly just laughs in response. He goes on to ask how the two of them will even manage to afford to live in a grand home like this because Peter was a successful lawyer. He and Holly, on the other hand, aren't as wealthy. Just then, Sophie wakes up crying and the two of them rush to attempt her to calm down, though are unable to do so. They try to sing to her, which fails, and then realize that she may be hungry. As Holly desperately tries to prepare food to feed Sophie, Eric asks her if she's thought about the long-term consequences of raising a child may have for her, specifically in regards to dating. Holly responds that he knows nothing about her, as she struggles to open a child-proof drawer. Eric points this out as an example of why they may not be the best choices to raise Sophie, though Holly disagrees, wishing they honor the memories of their now-deceased friends as they chose them. Holly then tries to feed Sophie, who ends up spitting out the food she made for her, crying while refusing to eat. Eric then walks over and feeds Sophie snacks he got from out of a cupboard, which she happily eats. He again asks Holly if she truly believes they are what's best for the child, as he walks away, leaving her to contemplate his words. Sometime in the near future, Allison and Peter's funerals are held. Afterward, during the function, some of their friends are speaking to each other, gossiping how they aren't too confident with Holly and Eric taking care of Sophie. Meanwhile, the two of them try to scout potential guardians for Sophie other than themselves. They meet Peter's cousin, who is the father of 9 other children and struggles to keep track of his own. Next, they meet Peter's father, who is clearly not in the best of health. Peter's father comments on how much Sophie looks like his son, looking at his granddaughter crawling across the floor. Eric and Holly immediately attempt to ask him if he would be interested in taking Sophie in. But before they can ask the question, Sophie pulls out her grandfather's oxygen supply and he begins to struggle to breathe. Holly rushes over and assists the now gasping senior man, while Eric picks up Sophie. Holly, Eric, and Sophie attend a court hearing along with Peter's lawyer. The judge quickly grants them legal custody of Sophie, much to Holly's delight, though Eric voices his frustrations at not being questioned further, as he states that they could be dealers or pimps. The judge asks him if they're dealers or pimps, and Holly laughs as she drags Eric away. Later that day, Eric and Holly arrive back at home with Sophie. Eric monologues about how he's been careful in relationships to not end up with the child, yet he has still ended up with the child. Just then, he realizes Sophie has pooped in her diaper and immediately hands her to Holly. The two of them are confused about what to do, as neither wants to be the one to change diapers. The two of them argue for a while, but then Eric steps forward to change the diaper, even though he's never changed one before. Eric takes Sophie's diaper off, and the two of them begin panicking as the room is filled by the smell. The pair aren't sure what to do, and Eric tries to clean Sophie with wipes. Just then, the doorbell rings and Eric leaves Holly to clean up while he answers the door. He is surprised to see Peter and Allison's friends from Sophie's birthday party, who have brought food for the new parents. Eric is confused but suspects no ill intentions, so invites the group in. He goes back to check in on Holly to see that she has successfully changed Sophie's diaper. However, she has managed to get some poop on her cheek without realizing. Eric is about to inform her of this, though Holly doesn't want to hear it, as she's not happy that he left her to change the diaper on her own and storms off. Holly comes down to greet the group of friends, who inform her that she has poop on her face. Eric comes downstairs holding Sophie, while Holly runs back up as she is horrified by what has happened. However, Eric stands there not being able to hold back his laughter. Later, Holly and Eric listen to what the group has to say to them. The group advises the two of them on how hard parenting can be, and what they will need to make it bearable. Holly asks Eric to write it all down. The trio end up spending their days together, bonding in the process as they navigate through the ups and downs of parenting. One night, the two of them are giving Sophie a bath when suddenly, Holly realizes that Sophie is making her poop face. She and Eric quickly scoop Holly out of the bath and carry her towards the toilet. But before Holly can put down the baby seat, Sophie poops and Holly quickly takes Eric's hat to catch it. Eric voices his frustrations at Holly using his hat as a makeshift potty, but the two see the funny side and both of them start laughing. However, the laughing is short-lived as Holly spots a lump on Sophie's abdomen, which she is adamant has not always been there. The next day, Holly takes Sophie to the doctor's office. To her surprise, Sam is Sophie's doctor today. Sam offers his condolences as he was informed about Peter and Allison's accident, and knew they were dear friends of Holly's. Sam inspects Sophie, and while Holly is voicing her sadness about losing her best friend, and measuring up to her in taking care of her child, Sam informs her that Sophie's lump is nothing to worry about. Sam writes a note, and Holly panics believing that he's writing something for Sophie, but he hands her a note saying it is instead for her. Holly reads the note and is amused to see that he has prescribed her a glass of wine, as he believes she needs to distress and take more breaks. Later that night, Eric is surprised to come home to Holly drunk with a bottle of wine. Holly reminisces about the time Allison tried to set her up with Eric, and how terrible the date was. She then insults Eric and states that it feels good to insult him to his face. Eric picks her up by the arm and instructs her to go upstairs and go to bed. Just then, there is a knock at the door, and Eric is surprised to see that a social worker is at the door to conduct an unannounced visit. Before he can let the social worker in, Eric instructs Holly to go upstairs and take a shower to sober up, as they could be in trouble if the social worker was to see that Holly is drunk. Afterwards, the two of them are asked a series of questions by the social worker, mainly in regards to their plans. Holly, still somewhat drunk, answers that she would like some aesthetical changes to her bakery, but then takes it back when she realizes she doesn't mention Sophie in her answer. Eric states that he's the technical director for an NBA team and that he has aspirations for promotion in the near future. The two of them are asked if they're in a relationship, and they both immediately deny this. This prompts the two of them to start arguing, but are immediately silenced when the social worker states that they're trying to prevent Sophie from losing more people close to her, and that she's not too sure if the two of them are cut out to be parents. One night, Sophie is crying constantly, which makes Holly and Eric panic. The two of them resort to calling Allison's young babysitter, who lives in the neighborhood. When the babysitter arrives, she takes Sophie, and she quickly stops crying. Sometime in the future, Eric receives a call from work informing him that he will be in the director's chair that night. He is over the moon, though he realizes he has an issue as it is the same day as Holly's Riverside event, which she has been planning for 3 months, and refuses to cancel for Eric. Before leaving, Holly advises he ask someone he knows to look after Sophie, so he doesn't have to cancel his big night. Later, Eric takes a taxi to work. The driver is someone he is friendly with, named Walter. Eric has taken Sophie with him and tries to bribe the taxi driver to babysit Sophie, and in exchange, he will pay him triple what the meter states, as well as get him tickets to the next Hawks game. Walter tries to refuse, but Eric is stubborn and ends up convincing him. While in the booth, Eric is directing, finally doing his dream job. Just then, he gets a phone call from Walter, who informs him that Sophie has pooped her diaper. Eric rushes out at halftime and quickly changes her diaper, and tries to hand her back to Walter, who then states that he won't continue to look after Sophie unless he can go into the booth as well. At first, Eric is not on board, but then ultimately gives in. Simon asks him if his babysitter is his cab driver, which Eric confirms. Sophie begins crying, and Eric begs Walter to look after her. But he isn't a good babysitter, and Eric's night is a disaster as he is unable to properly direct the cameras during the game. Afterwards, Holly walks into Sophie's room where Eric is singing the child to sleep. He puts her in her crib, and Holly asks him why he seems so miserable. Eric responds it's because he is miserable, that before he was forced to take care of a child, his life was amazing before he had to ruin his life for Sophie. Holly is disgusted at him, stating that Eric only cares about sleeping with multiple women and that he's not half the man Peter was. Eric refuses to listen to her, storming off and stating that she doesn't understand because her life has always been depressing. Holly asks him not to ride his motorcycle around kids, and Eric turns around replying that she is not his kid, with tears in his eyes before he rides off into the night, Later that night, Eric comes back home, and Holly apologizes for what she said to him. Eric sits next to her on the couch and states that he needs to take care of Sophie for Peter because Peter would have done the same for him. Holly asks him to watch a home video that Peter made. In the video, Peter surprises Allison by showing her Sophie's room he apparently painted. However, Allison saw through his lies but was more annoyed that he had the room painted when Sophie needed to sleep in there. The two of them break into an argument, and Allison, with Sophie in her arms, refuses to allow her daughter to sleep in that room and storms out. Eric realizes why Holly had asked him to watch the video, that they can still be good parents to Sophie even if they argue regularly. The two of them agree they have to stop acting like their deceased friends are coming back. Then Eric puts his arm around Holly. Some time passes, and Holly and Eric make the home their own by decorating and moving out some of the stuff that belonged to their late friends. Eric even starts dating a woman named Jill, though he struggles to remember her name, which amuses Holly. Later that day, Eric goes for a run, and all the neighbor friends of Peter and Allison are acting strangely nice to him, attempting to strike up a conversation when all he is trying to do is go for his daily run. Eric is watching TV with Sophie one day when she randomly gets up on 2 feet and takes a few steps, much to his surprise. Eric immediately gets up and calls for Holly to get out of the bath and to the living room as soon as possible, as Holly is about to work. Holly shouts back, asking him to stall her somehow, which makes Eric panic and ends up pushing Sophie, who begins crying. Holly berates Eric for making Sophie cry, stating that she'll now be traumatized by walking. However, it isn't long before Sophie is walking confidently, and Eric has to put up gates for the stairs. One day, the trio visits the grocery store, where Holly catches Eric smiling at a woman who is shopping there. She immediately realizes that this is the place where Eric meets most of the women he dates, and he doesn't deny it, nor denies using Sophie to bait them in. Holly asks to see an example of him starting a conversation with a woman he is interested in and is surprised when she realizes that he's good at reading social cues. Just then, they're interrupted by Sam, who also happens to be shopping in the same grocery store. Holly is glad to see him, and Eric takes Sophie so the two of them can speak in private. Sam ends up asking Holly out, and the two even set a date, much to Holly's delight. The day of Holly's date with Sam finally arrives, and Eric cannot help but tease her before the two of them leave. Holly is confused as to where Sam is taking her, as they arrive at the back door of a fancy restaurant. However, Sam reveals he is the doctor of the restaurant owner's daughters, so he is allowing him to take his date to private seating at the back of the restaurant. Meanwhile, Eric is feeding Sophie and is practicing what he would say if he were to ever take a woman on a dinner date himself. Sam and Holly are enjoying their date, and Sam casually reveals that he has been married before, but no longer with his wife. Holly is surprised but doesn't seem too fazed by the reveal. Just then, Holly's phone rings and realizes it is Eric calling. She is annoyed by this and reminds Eric that tonight is her night off. However, Eric has not called to speak to her, but Sam. She hands over her phone to Sam, who instructs Eric to take Sophie to the emergency room. Holly asks what has happened, and Sam informs her that Sophie has a high temperature. She immediately gets up from her seat and states that she must go to Sophie, and Sam follows. At the Sam gets Sophie's test results and informs Holly and Eric that Sophie has a urinary tract infection, and that she will require treatment even though it's not a serious concern. Eric thanks Sam for his help, and Sam states that he was looking forward to dropping Holly off at home. Holly leans in and kisses Sam, and she thanks him as he informs her that he'll call her later. The next day, Eric ecstatically informs Holly that Sophie's temperature has come down. Holly is sitting at the table, with her head in her hands over the cost of Sophie's medical bills. Eric asks her to not worry about the money and then spots some flowers that Sam got for her. Holly states that with all the costs that come with raising her child, she will have to put the expansion of her bakery on hold. Eric asks her not to, and that he will give her the money she needs. Surprised by the gesture, Holly is reluctant to accept Eric's offer, but ends up doing so when he states that she should think of it as an investment rather than a gift. Holly is excited and informs him of all the benefits of being an investor in her business, and Eric adds that she throws in dinner tonight, which she gladly accepts. That night, Holly has their usual babysitter watch Sophie for the night. Meanwhile, Eric and Holly head out to her bakery where they finally have their dinner date, the one they never made it to all those years ago. Dinner goes smoothly, the both of them all smiles and laughs. Later, Holly attempts to ride Eric's motorcycle, who isn't sure whether it is a good idea for her to do so. Eric instructs her on how to ride, asking her not to let go of the clutch until he gets on as well. However, Holly lets go of the clutch, the motorcycle flies forward and Eric immediately catches Holly as she's flung off it. Unfortunately, the motorcycle continues to move until it crashes across the road and then is run over by an incoming bus. Eric watches his beloved motorcycle crushed before his eyes, Holly asking him if he's mad. He says nothing but sits down on the pavement, clearly upset. The two of them eventually arrive back home, and Holly offers to pay for his crushed motorcycle. However, Eric assures her that it's fine and that isn't necessary. Once inside, the two of them are pleased to see that Sophie is asleep. Eric pays the babysitter, and before she leaves, she comments that the two of them make a good couple and runs off home. Holly laughs off her comment, but Eric doesn't. Instead, he steps closer to Sophie, and the two begin to kiss. Holly and Eric become intimate and are fully aware of what they're doing and with whom, even spending the night together in Peter and Allison's old room. Afterward, Holly asks Eric if it's possible that their late friends knew that they would end up like this. Just then, Eric finds Peter's stash of and suggests to Holly that they smoke it together. Holly rejects this idea, though proposes they use it to make brownies instead, which they end up doing and eating several before falling asleep in the same bed. The next day, the social worker, Janine, shows up unannounced again. Eric rushes downstairs to open the door for her, then rushes back upstairs to make sure Holly is ready for her visit. Holly is annoyed by Janine's timing and instructs Eric to hide the brownies and other evidence of use. The two quickly get cleaned up and eventually let Janine in. At the start of the meeting, Janine comments how the two of them look like they're settling into the role of Sophie's new parents. She then asks the two of them how their relationship with one another is and can immediately tell that the two of them have been recently intimate. Surprisingly, Janine isn't happy about this, even though the two of them not being a couple was her initial concern. Eric is back at work and speaks to Simon about his new relationship with Holly. Simon, however, is disappointed that his last single friend is no longer single, and he states that marriage is a prison. Just then, their conversation is interrupted by Eric's boss, who wants to speak to him in private. The boss acknowledges Eric had a disastrous debut as studio director. However, he offers him a job in Phoenix where he will be in the director's seat. Eric is speechless, knowing that is his dream job, yet it will mean he will have to leave Holly and Sophie to move to Phoenix. Holly and Eric are out with Sophie, having their faces painted to look like cats. Their neighbors look on, gossiping with one another about how they've likely been intimate. Just then a colleague of Eric's comes up and congratulates him on his new job in Phoenix. Eric thanks him and Holly looks at him confused as she has no idea what the man is talking about. Holly questions Eric about the job, and he comes clean telling her everything. She then asks him if he's turned it down, which he doesn't confirm he has, though states that he doesn't want to be rude and turn it down straight away. The two of them argue, and Eric states that he gave up everything to play the part that was forced onto him. Holly takes Sophie, crying, informing him that he should accept the job offer. Some time has passed, and Sam has moved in with Holly and Sophie. The three of them now seemingly live happily without Eric in their lives anymore. Meanwhile, Eric is busy at work in Phoenix and now lives alone. Just like the way he was before, but not as happy. One day, Eric takes a trip to Holly's bakery, and he is delighted to see Sophie there as well. Eric is there to pick up Sophie, as he is taking her for a few days while Holly is busy. Before he can step out the door, Holly asks him if he would like to come to a Thanksgiving event Sam is hosting for some friends and neighbors, and Eric agrees. On Thanksgiving, Eric arrives to find all the neighbors and Sam at his old home for the gathering. Sam greets him and states that he believes that he's a bigger part of this house than anyone, and this is a perfect to bid farewell to it. This confuses Eric, as doesn't understand what Sam means by this. Eric confronts Holly in the kitchen, furious that she didn't consult him before deciding to sell the house. He accuses her of trying to replace him, and Holly reminds him that he was the one who ran away from them to Phoenix. Eric instead reminds her that this is the life she wanted, but not what he did. Holly replies that she didn't want this life with someone who didn't love her, and Eric responds that he did love her, and still does. All this is happening while the neighbors and Sam can hear every word from the living room. A silence fills the room, but then Holly turns around and states that they were just pretending. Now they don't have to pretend anymore. Eric informs her that he's headed back to Phoenix and apologizes to the rest of the guests, as he hugs Sophie and then leaves. Later that night, after the guests have left, Sam asks Holly if maybe they should put a hold on their relationship as she has some unresolved feelings for Eric. He states that if he and his wife argued like that, they'd still be together. Sam kisses her forehead and takes his leave after admitting that he'll miss them. During a meeting with Janine, Holly speaks about the difficulty of being a lone guardian, though is determined to make it work. Just then, she spots a picture of Eric, Sophie, and herself together and informs Janine that she has to get to the airport. At the airport, Eric has arrived to catch his flight to Phoenix, watching videos of Holly and Sophie while he waits to board. Holly, who has Janine and Sophie with her, arrives at the airport to talk Eric out of leaving, though she is too late as his plane has already taken off. Janine is in tears, upset that Holly didn't get to see Eric, as the three of them arrive back home. Holly asks her not to be upset, as she will somehow manage as long as she has Sophie. Janine takes her leave, and Holly takes Sophie inside, where she is startled to see that Eric is sitting in the living room. Eric states that he now knows why their friends chose them to take care of Sophie in their absence, and it was because they were already a family. He then reiterates the fact that he loves her, and the two embrace and hold one another. In the closing scene, Sophie has turned 2 years old, and Holly has hosted a party for her, inviting all their friends and neighbors. She reveals 2 cakes to Eric, one for Sophie and one for them, as they've now done their first year of being together as a family. She brings the cake into the living room, and everyone sings Sophie happy birthday.